She came carrying 7 freezing, half-starved children and collapsed in his barn like hope had run out. Samuel Boone hadn't opened his door for anyone in 2 years, not since grief turned his house cold and his heart colder. But when he saw them there, frostbitten, hungry, and holding on to each other like life itself, he stepped aside, and with that one choice, a lonely rancher and a broken family began to find their way home. If you believe one quiet act of mercy can change a life, stay with us. The lantern's flame danced low against the frost-laced window pane, its golden light barely warming the edges of Samuel Boone's quiet world. Outside, snow fell in solemn sheets, each flake a whispered confession from the sky, burying the land beneath soft, merciless weight. The barn roof sagged under it. Fence posts disappeared by the hour. Even the old cottonwood tree, naked, gnarled, stubborn, stood bowed as if mourning alongside him. Inside the house, the fire burned small and tame, a reluctant glow in the stone hearth. His supper sat untouched on the table, bread going stale beside cold beans and bitter coffee left in a chipped enamel cup. The rocking chair creaked under his stillness, each sway a slow concession to time and habit. He wasn't waiting for anything, wasn't hoping, just listening. That's how life had been for 2 winters now, since the ground froze hard enough to take Eliza from him, since the cottonwood refused to bloom that following spring, as though the earth itself recognized her absence and saw no point in pretending otherwise. Samuel kept going because that's what men did. Feed the horse, split the wood, haul water, patch the roof when it leaked, drink coffee black and bitter like old regrets. His days became rows of chores lined up like gravestones, silent markers for time he no longer felt passing. He didn't visit town much, not since the funeral. Folks were kind enough at first. Soft words, shared pies, invitations to Sunday service. But pity wears thin faster than wool in winter, and soon their glances became edged with discomfort, as though grief was something contagious, as though silence was a fault to be corrected. Samuel preferred the company of wind and snow. Both kept their distance and spoke only when necessary. That night the storm pressed harder against the house, wind clawing at the eaves, rattling loose boards. The sky hung heavy, low, like a wool blanket soaked through with sorrow. The air inside turned close and brittle, and Samuel laid another log on the fire more out of obligation than warmth. Then came the sound. A thud. Low, wrong, out of place. Not the groan of settling wood or the sharp crack of ice splitting along the barn's beams. No, this was something else. Something living. Samuel froze, every nerve gone tight like a pulled wire. He listened, breath held, ears straining past the wind. There it was again, a muffled shift, a low groan, the kind a man makes when the cold bites deep into bone and mercy comes slow. He stood, the floorboards sighing under his weight, reached for the lantern, its glass hot against his calloused fingers. Then the rifle, leaning where it always did near the door, oiled and ready though it hadn't seen use in months. The cold slapped him full across the face as he stepped onto the porch. Sharp, immediate. The kind of cold that found the gaps in a man's coat and settled there like spite. His breath turned to fog in the air, each exhale a gray ghost against the dark. Snow crunched beneath his boots, layers thick and reluctant to give. With careful steps he crossed the yard toward the barn, holding the lantern high, rifle loose but ready in his other hand. The barn stood silent, hunched like a sleeping giant under its heavy roof. Snow clung to its sides, draped across the door like a warning. Samuel set the lantern on a fence post, slid the barn door aside with slow, deliberate hands. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, the dark was thick and waiting. The air smelled of hay, damp wood, and something else, something human. Samuel's eyes adjusted slowly. Shapes began to form along the far wall. Blankets, a tangle of limbs, a pair of wide eyes blinking back at him from the shadows. Then more eyes, and more. 7 small bodies, curled together like orphaned pups trying to keep warm. And crouched in front of them, a woman. Thin, ragged, hair falling loose over her shoulders like wet earth. Her dress torn at the hem, her hands spread wide, shielding the children with a fierceness that made Samuel's throat tighten. For one long breath, no one moved. The storm howled behind him. Samuel lowered the rifle just slightly, but didn't speak. Not yet. He stood there, lantern casting long trembling shadows against the hay-strewn floor, and wondered what kind of trouble had come to find him on a night like this. Her voice, when it finally came, was cracked and low, like branches breaking under frost. "We're leaving soon," she said, her arms still stretched around the children, shielding them with a body that looked too thin to withstand much more cold or fear. Didn't mean to trespass, just needed to get them out of the wind. Samuel stood there, unmoving. The lantern light flickered across the angles of her face, hollow cheeks, a healing bruise at her jawline, and lips split from cold. She looked at him as if expecting the worst, as if she'd already rehearsed how she'd beg or fight or run. The children, bundled in thin, patched clothing, barely looked up. One little girl, no more than 3 by Samuel's guess, burrowed deeper beneath her brother's coat, her small hands clutching at his shirt like roots desperate for soil. Samuel let out a slow breath, clouding the cold between them. "No one's getting thrown out tonight," he said, voice low, rough from disuse. "Not in this weather." Her shoulders sagged. Not with relief exactly. More like the collapse of someone too tired to hold herself upright anymore. He stepped back from the door. "Get them inside," he added. "Fire's warmer than this." For a moment she hesitated, as if unsure whether this was a trick or some passing kindness that might turn sharp before morning. But the boy, probably the oldest, was already helping the others to their feet, swaying on frost-bitten legs. One by one they stumbled past Samuel, heads bowed, too cold and too used to being unwelcome to speak. The woman came last. Her eyes caught his for just a breath. There was no gratitude there, only wariness, and something like shame. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds gone stale. Samuel cleared his throat, awkward as a man trying to speak a language he'd long forgotten. "Sit 'em by the fire," he said, pointing toward the hearth. "I'll find blankets." The children crowded close to the flames, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably, teeth chattering like loose wagon wheels on stone. The little one who'd hidden in the barn now whimpered in her sleep, her face flushed with cold and exhaustion. Samuel returned with an armful of worn quilts and old coats, leftovers from before, from when Eliza used to keep a closet full of things, just in case company came. Funny how useless it had all seemed until this exact moment. The woman took the blankets without speaking, wrapping each child with a care that was practiced, efficient, but tender. She didn't fuss or whisper comforts, just worked, steady and silent, like a woman used to doing what needed doing without wasting words. Samuel busied himself at the stove, setting water to boil for coffee and peeling a few shriveled potatoes he'd kept stored in the cellar. It wasn't much, but it was something warm. By the time he slid the pot onto the heat, the children were half asleep, their bodies slack with that bone-deep weariness that only hunger and cold can bring. The woman sat apart from them, hands folded in her lap, back straight despite her obvious exhaustion. "What's your name?" Samuel asked after a while, stirring the pot slow, watching her from the corner of his eye. She hesitated, as though weighing the safety of an answer. "Nora," she said at last. "Nora Price." He nodded. The name suited her somehow. Plain but strong, with edges worn soft by weather and time. "Samuel Boone," he said in return, setting a cracked bowl of potato broth in front of her. "Eat." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the spoon, but she didn't spill a drop. Every bite was measured, slow, like she was making it last. The children roused at the smell of food, and Samuel portioned what little there was among them. They ate without complaint, without talking, their eyes darting toward him now and then, as if waiting for the moment he'd decide they'd overstayed. But Samuel said nothing more, just sat in the corner chair, sipping coffee gone cold, watching the snow build higher against the window. When the last child drifted into sleep and the fire burned low, Nora began to rise from the floor, moving toward the door. Samuel stood before she could reach it. "Where you think you're going?" he asked, voice low. "Back to the barn," she said like it was obvious. He shook his head once, slow. "Ain't nobody sleeping in the cold tonight." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but the look in his eyes, steady, unyielding, stopped her. Without another word, she settled back beside the children, pulling one of the little ones into the curve of her arm. Samuel turned down the lamp, leaving the room awash in the soft, uncertain glow of the fire. And for the first time in 2 years, the house felt full. Not peaceful, not healed, but full. Like something, unfinished maybe, had started. Morning came slow, as it always did in winter. Pale gray light seeped through the frost-covered glass, soft and reluctant, touching the floorboards with a chill that made the air bite before breath even left the lungs. Samuel rose first, as was his habit, pulled on his boots by the door, shrugged into his coat, and stepped outside to check the livestock. The snow had let up, but the cold stayed fierce, the kind that turned wood stiff and made metal sing under touch. By the time he returned, stamping the snow from his boots, he found Nora already in the kitchen. She stood with her back to him, sleeves rolled to her elbows, pale arms dusted with flour. The smell of something baking, rough bread by the scent, filled the air. It was a smell the house hadn't worn in a long time. Not since Eliza. For a long moment Samuel just stood there, watching, listening to the small sounds of domestic life return to rooms that had sat too quiet for too long. The children were awake too. Samuel heard them moving upstairs, their voices low, uncertain, like they weren't sure how much noise they were allowed to make. One of the older boys came down first, his hair sticking up wild at the crown. The boy froze when he saw Samuel standing there, gaze flicking from him to Nora and back again like he expected a rebuke. "Morning," Samuel said, simple and soft, nodding once. The boy blinked, then ducked his head and mumbled a greeting before retreating to sit near the fire. Bit by bit, the others followed. 7 in total, boys and girls ranging from toddler to near grown, though none seemed older than maybe 12. They clustered together like birds unsure if the air was safe to fly in. Nora worked without asking for permission, scrubbing the table, checking the firewood pile, darning a tear in one girl's sleeve with thread she pulled from the lining of her own coat. Samuel didn't stop her, didn't offer thanks. It didn't feel like a day for words. Instead, he added more wood to the fire and went about tending the chores that couldn't wait. The roof needed clearing before the weight of snow brought it down. The water troughs needed breaking of their icy crust. Chickens, what few remained, needed feeding. Each time he came back inside, something had shifted. Another corner of the room swept clean. Another child sitting nearer the warmth, their eyes less wary. That afternoon he found Nora out back, kneeling beside the washtub with sleeves pushed high again, scrubbing at the children's clothes with water near frozen. Her breath came in thick clouds, her knuckles raw and red. "You'll catch your death," he said from the porch. She paused, sitting back on her heels, looking up at him with that same guarded stare she always wore. "They needed washing," she said simply. He nodded, not arguing, and disappeared into the shed to bring her an extra pair of gloves Eliza had left behind. He set them on the railing without a word. By the time he checked again, they were on her hands. Evenings became quieter, but different now. Samuel found himself lingering near the hearth instead of retreating to the barn or the porch as he once had. The children would settle on the floor with scraps of fabric, small games, or just lean into each other for warmth. Nora always sat a little apart, sewing, mending, or simply staring into the fire with a tiredness too deep for sleep to cure. One night, after the younger ones had drifted off, she stood to clear the bowls from supper. Samuel rose too, meeting her halfway. "I'll take those," he said, holding out his hands. Her eyes lifted, surprised but unreadable. She handed the bowls over, her fingers brushing his just briefly. Cool skin, calloused palms, a touch too fleeting to mean anything. And yet, their eyes met for half a breath longer than necessary. Not enough to speak of, but enough to notice. Samuel returned to the sink, scrubbing the dishes with more care than he was used to giving. Behind him he heard her gathering blankets for the children, her movements quieter now, more measured. By the time he banked the fire and climbed the stairs to his own room, the house felt settled, still broken in places, still haunted by absence, but full, and slowly, almost against his will, Samuel realized. He was beginning to hope that come morning, they'd still be here. The days stretched longer, though the sun still stayed low in the sky, offering only weak threads of light across the snow-covered land. In town, talk traveled faster than the thaw. By the second week, folks at the general store were already whispering, "Have you heard about Samuel Boone? Taken in some strange woman, with a whole passel of children no less. No kin to him. No preacher's blessing. Just living there. Miss Winslow, the postmistress and unofficial guardian of moral standards in their corner of the county, was the first to voice her disapproval aloud, loud enough for it to reach Samuel's ears the next time he rode in for supplies. "Winter or not," she said with a pinched mouth and a shake of her gray curls, "it's no business for a man to keep a woman under his roof with no formal arrangement. And children. Heavens." Samuel said nothing, just paid for the flour, lamp oil, and the bolt of fabric Nora had added to the list. Something for making clothes for the children, she'd said, too quietly for him to refuse. On the ride home, the cold bit sharper than usual, but it wasn't the wind that stung his skin. At the house, things unfolded slow and steady. Nora continued her quiet work, mending socks, teaching the older girls how to stitch a straight line, showing the boys how to split kindling without losing fingers. She didn't speak much to Samuel, but when she did, it was always practical, always needed. "Could you check the leak in the roof over the back room? We're out of salt. One of the little ones is coughing. Could you fetch something from town?" Her voice never lingered in the air. Arrived, did its job, and was gone. But it was in the spaces between words that something else began to build. Samuel noticed how she kept a piece of twine in her pocket, using it to tie back her hair each morning. How she hummed, low and tuneless, when she stirred the stew pot. How her hands, though rough and cracked, moved gentle across a child's fevered brow. One evening, as the sun sank in copper and ash over the hills, Samuel found her on the porch, staring at the cottonwood tree. "Was your wife buried there?" she asked without turning. He nodded, unsure how she knew. She hugged her arms tight across her chest, gaze fixed on the bare branches clawing against the winter sky. "It's a good place," she said, "for remembering." They stood there in silence, two figures outlined against the snow, letting the cold press against them without speaking of it. Inside, the children laughed over some small joke, laughter still strange and bright inside these walls, like sunlight on a floor long left dusty. But not everyone outside this home found their arrangement so acceptable. The pastor came by next, coat buttoned high, hat in hand. His voice held no judgment, only concern, as he stood on Samuel's porch one afternoon with boots caked in snow. "Some of the ladies," the pastor began, clearing his throat. "They're concerned. Talk's been stirring." Samuel stood in the doorway, letting the cold air stay between them. "About what?" "About appearance, mostly." The pastor hesitated. "You know how folks are. They don't always mean harm, but they do notice. Arrangements." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for company," he said, "but I won't turn out a woman and 7 children to satisfy gossip." The pastor nodded, stepping back, hands raised in mild surrender. "I know your heart's good, Boone. Just be mindful. This town forgets kindness faster than it forgets scandal." With that, the pastor left, his figure disappearing down the snow-packed road. That night, Samuel found Nora sitting at the kitchen table after the children had gone to bed. Her sewing lay untouched in her lap. "Miss Winslow came by," she said without looking up. "Told me there's work at the laundry house in town. Suggested I might be better off elsewhere." Samuel crossed the room slow, pulling out the chair opposite her. "You're better off here," he said, plain and steady. For the first time in days, she met his eyes and didn't look away. There was no promise in his words, no grand gesture, just something simple and true. Enough, for now. The snow began to melt in slow, grudging patches, revealing dead grass and muddy ruts beneath. The air still bit cold in the mornings, but the sun lingered longer now, stretching pale gold across the hills before dipping west. Hope, like the thaw, came soft and unnoticed at first. The children played outside more, their laughter scattering like startled birds across the yard. Nora planted her hands in her hips one afternoon and scolded the boys for tracking mud across the clean floors. Samuel watched from the barn door, a faint, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth before he turned back to mending fence posts. Then came the day that shifted everything. It started with Dusty, Samuel's old bay mare, lifting her head from the trough and letting out a restless snort, her ears pinned back, eyes watching the tree line with stiff unease. The dog followed, rising from his spot by the porch, tail low, growl rumbling like distant thunder. Samuel's gut tightened the way it always had before trouble. By the time he stepped onto the porch, the riders were already in view. 3 men on horseback, cutting across the field with a confidence that spoke of ownership where none existed. At the front rode Isaac Weaver. Samuel didn't need Nora to say his name. The shape of the man, broad-shouldered, mean-eyed, mouth curled in permanent disgust, spoke it loud enough. Nora appeared behind Samuel before he could turn to stop her. She froze when she saw the lead rider. Her face drained of what little color the winter hadn't already taken. Samuel felt her fear like a pulse against his back. Isaac swung down from his horse, boots hitting the mud with a wet slap. His coat flared behind him, stained with trail dust and sweat, and his belt rode heavy with a revolver that hung too easy at his hip. "Well, well," Isaac drawled, looking Nora up and down like she was something half-broken and barely worth the effort. "Ain't this a fine picture? Didn't expect to find you holed up like some squatter's wife." The other 2 men stayed mounted, rifles laid casual across their laps. Watching, waiting. Nora didn't answer, her hands clenched tight at her sides, trembling so hard Samuel could see it from where he stood. Samuel stepped forward, planting himself between her and the approaching threat. "She's not going anywhere with you," Samuel said, voice low, steady, like the earth underfoot. Isaac sneered. "Ain't your choice, Boone. Blood's blood. Those kids, they're family, and she's my responsibility now that her sister's gone. Ain't no court in this territory gonna argue that." Samuel's jaw worked once before he spoke again. "You don't need a court," he said. "You just need to leave." Isaac's smile turned colder. "You think you can stop me? 1 man against 3? His gaze flicked toward the barn, the windows, as if measuring how many bullets the house could hold before it splintered apart. From behind them came the shuffle of small feet. Samuel turned just enough to see the children gathered at the doorway, shoulders pressed tight, eyes wide and afraid, but present, watching. And then something happened. The oldest boy, thin, sharp-eyed, still with scabs on his knuckles from splitting wood, stepped out first, stood beside Samuel. No words, just a stance that said, "Here." Then another, then 2 more. Nora let out a sound, a broken, soft thing halfway between a cry and a breath, but she didn't stop them. She only pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Isaac laughed, low and humorless. "What's this? Gonna fight me with a pack of half-starved brats?" Samuel didn't answer. Instead, from the road behind them, another voice rose. "Afternoon, Isaac." It was Pastor Green, astride his own tired horse, shotgun resting across his lap like it belonged there. "You're trespassing," the pastor continued, riding closer. "And you know how Samuel feels about uninvited guests." Isaac's face twisted. His hands hovered near his holster but didn't draw. A long, breathless moment stretched between all of them. The wind shifted. Dusty pawed the dirt. Finally, Isaac spat in the snow. "This ain't over," he hissed. Then he turned, mounted, and rode off, his men following without a word. The air felt thinner once they were gone, as if the house and the land around it had been holding its breath too. Nora sank to her knees in the dirt, pulling the youngest child into her arms. Samuel stayed standing, eyes fixed on the tree line, watching until there was no dust left on the horizon. And only then did he breathe. The house stayed quiet after that day. Not the same kind of quiet it had worn before. This was different, thicker, like the air itself had absorbed the fear, and now held it in the walls and floorboards. Nora barely spoke for 2 days. She moved like a woman walking through water, slow and distant, her mind caught somewhere her body couldn't follow. When she did speak, it was to the children. Soft reminders to eat, to rest, to stay close. Samuel gave her space, but watched. He noticed the way her hands trembled when she tried to thread a needle, how she stood at the window long after dark, staring toward the tree line like she expected Isaac to come riding back at any moment, the way she flinched when the dog barked too sudden or a door slammed too hard. One evening, after the children had settled, Samuel stepped outside, needing air. The sky stretched wide and full of stars, each one sharp enough to cut. His breath fogged in front of him as he stood by the fence, staring at the cottonwood. The ground beneath it stayed frozen, but the branches reached higher now, as if refusing to bow. Behind him, he heard the door creak open. Soft footsteps followed. Nora stood beside him, pulling her shawl tighter across her shoulders. Her face, turned up to the sky, looked older in the moonlight. Tired, but strong in ways that went deeper than bone. "I hate being afraid," she said at last, voice barely above a whisper. Samuel kept his eyes on the stars. "You're allowed," he said. She let out a bitter, broken laugh. "Doesn't feel like it." Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The cold settled between them, but neither stepped back inside. Finally, Samuel cleared his throat. "You're safe here," he said. Simple words, but spoken like a promise. Her head dipped just once, not in agreement but in something close to acceptance. In the days that followed, she began to return to herself, slowly like spring thawing the edges of a frozen creek. Her steps grew steadier. Her voice, though still quiet, carried more weight. She started baking again. Real bread this time, not just flour and water stretched thin. She taught the girls how to knead the dough, laughing, soft and fleeting, when the youngest made more mess than progress. Samuel found himself lingering near the kitchen doorway more often, listening, watching. One cold morning, while mending a section of fence out back, he heard Nora call for him, urgency in her voice. Dropping the hammer, he ran for the house, heart already braced for disaster. Instead, he found her kneeling near the hearth, holding the littlest one, her skin flushed with fever, her small body shaking with chills. Samuel knelt beside them. "I'll ride for the doctor," he said without hesitation. But Nora's hand shot out, catching his sleeve. "No time," she said, already reaching for a cloth and the small tin of willow bark she'd stashed on the shelf days earlier. "We keep her warm. Wet cloths for the fever. And pray." Samuel hesitated, watching her work with a focus that trembled only in the smallest edges. So he did what she asked, boiled water, fetched extra blankets, and when she knelt beside the child with eyes closed tight in silent prayer, Samuel stood close behind her, bowed his head, hands folded, though prayer hadn't passed his lips since the day they'd buried Eliza. The fever broke near dawn, slow but sure. Nora wept then, not loud, not showy, just tears falling unchecked as she cradled the little girl close, rocking her with the kind of gentleness only born from near loss. Samuel sat beside them, hand resting light on Nora's shoulder, not asking, not speaking, just there. By morning, as the sun rose pink and silver across the snow, Samuel stepped outside to split more wood for the fire, his heart heavier, but somehow fuller. Behind him, through the cracked door, he heard Nora's voice, singing something low and sweet, her words drifting soft over the floorboards. And for the first time in what felt like years, Samuel smiled. Not wide, not bright, but real. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with small, stubborn victories. The first green blades pushing through thawed earth, the creek behind the barn trickling again after months locked in ice. The cottonwood showed its first tight buds, pale and shy, like hope testing the air. But with the thaw came something else. Letters from town, warnings. Isaac had been seen at the edge of the county, drunk, armed, asking questions. Samuel read each note in silence, folding them into the pocket of his coat without comment. Nora noticed the tightness in his shoulders, the way he checked the rifle more often, cleaning the barrel, oiling the stock, the way he stood longer at the porch each night, eyes sweeping the dark like a man waiting for trouble. The children, too, sensed the shift. Their laughter dulled. They stayed closer to the house, eyes darting toward the road when a stranger's wagon passed too near. Then one evening it happened. Isaac rode in just after sundown, alone this time, but with a fury that burned plain across his face. He dismounted without bothering to tie his horse, stumbling toward the house with whiskey on his breath and a revolver loose in his grip. Nora stood at the window, one hand pressed flat against the glass. Samuel moved before she could. Stepping out onto the porch, rifle already cradled against his shoulder, sight trained steady. Isaac laughed, low, mean. "You really think you'll shoot me, Boone? Over her?" Samuel's voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "I won't let you take her." The two men stood frozen in the space between breaths, the air thick with pine and dirt and old, bitter history. Inside, the children clustered around Nora, pulling at her skirts, wide-eyed and silent. One of the boys, Sam couldn't tell which, clutched a kitchen knife in both hands, knuckles white. Nora turned from the window, her heart pounding so loud she thought the children might hear it. She crossed the room, pulled the knife gently from the boy's hands, and knelt beside him. "Stay here," she whispered. Without another thought, she stepped out onto the porch. Her bare feet kissed cold wood. Her dress, too thin for spring, clung to her legs as she moved past Samuel, standing between him and Isaac. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way it hadn't been in years. "I won't go with you," she said. "Not now. Not ever." Isaac's eyes narrowed, rage and disbelief swirling together. "You think this man can keep you safe?" Nora lifted her chin. "I don't care if he can. I care that he's willing to try." Her words hung in the air, brittle and sharp, cutting clean through the last strands of fear that had wrapped her tight for so long. Samuel's heart pulled hard in his chest at that. Not from pride, not from rescue, but from something older, something like belonging. Isaac stepped forward, but Samuel cocked the rifle, slow and deliberate, the sound loud as thunder in the evening air. "You take one more step," Samuel said, "and you'll see exactly how far I'm willing to go." For one long, teetering moment, it felt like the world might break apart at the seams. Then Isaac spat into the dirt, turned on his heel, and stalked back to his horse. He climbed into the saddle with jerking, furious movements, cursed them both loud enough to wake the birds from the trees, and rode off toward the hills without looking back. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the night. The quiet that followed felt different this time, not tense but heavy with release. Nora let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her knees weakened beneath her, but Samuel caught her before she fell. He didn't speak, just helped her back inside, one hand steady at her back, the other reaching for her trembling fingers. Later that night, after the children had settled and the house grew still again, Samuel stood at the window, staring out across the fields. Nora approached, wrapping a shawl tight around her shoulders. She stood beside him, their shoulders just barely touching. "Thank you," she said softly. Samuel turned, looking at her fully for the first time in all the ways that mattered. "Wasn't a choice," he said. "Not for me." And somewhere deep in the earth beneath them, the cottonwood tree stretched its roots a little deeper, reaching for something warmer, something more permanent than winter. Spring deepened, peeling back the last brittle layers of winter like old wallpaper coming loose at the corners. The land softened underfoot. Rain replaced snow, and the cottonwood, silent for so long, finally showed its first small, pale leaves, fragile but determined. Inside the house, the air changed too, not suddenly, not with some grand declaration, but in the quiet, ordinary ways that life has of announcing itself. Samuel built new shelves for the pantry, sturdy ones wide enough to hold more than just a bachelor's sparse belongings. Nora stitched curtains for the upstairs rooms, piecing together fabric from old shirts and flour sacks, letting the children pick colors where they could. Laughter came easier now. The children chased each other across the yard, their bare feet kicking up mud where snow had ruled for months. The oldest boy, his shoulders growing broader with each week, helped Samuel patch fence rails and stack firewood. The girls took turns setting the table, arguing over spoons and plates like it mattered more than it did. And the littlest one, she learned to say Samuel's name soft and shy, but clear enough to turn his heart sideways when he heard it. Nora moved through the house with a steadier step. She still had moments where shadows pulled at her, the distant look when a door slammed too hard, the way her hands paused mid-task when the wind shifted just right, but she always came back from those silences, always returned to the room, to them. One Sunday morning, the pastor stopped by, not with warnings this time, but with an offer. "If you're ready," he said, hat in hand, standing at the bottom of their porch steps. "The barn's big enough for a gathering. Doesn't need to be fancy. Just something honest." Samuel looked to Nora. She stood in the doorway, her hair pulled back, a child balanced on each hip, her eyes softer than they'd been in months. She nodded, slow, thoughtful, but sure. The day they married, the sun broke clear and gold across the hills. Neighbors came, not all, but enough. Even Miss Winslow stood near the back, arms folded, lips pursed, but present nonetheless. Nora didn't wear white. She wore blue, the same faded dress she'd mended twice over. Her hands were steady as she stood across from Samuel, her fingers lacing with his without hesitation. There were no grand speeches, no practiced vows, just simple words, chosen words. "I choose this," Nora said, her voice catching only once. "Not because I have nowhere else, but because I want here, with you." Samuel's reply was plain, but carried the weight of every quiet promise he'd made her with actions these past months. "Here's yours," he said, "as long as you want it." The children stood clustered near the front, fidgeting, smiling, and when the pastor pronounced them man and wife, they let out a cheer so loud it shook dust from the rafters. Afterward, there was bread and soup passed hand to hand, laughter spilling from the barn doors into the yard. And later, long after neighbors left and the children drifted to sleep in a tangle of limbs and blankets, Samuel and Nora stood beneath the cottonwood. Nora carried something wrapped in muslin. Quietly, she knelt at the base of the tree, digging into the earth with her bare hands. Samuel stood beside her, lantern in one hand, watching as she buried the tattered dress she'd worn the night she arrived, the one torn at the hem, stained with fear and frost. A small, wordless ceremony, not of loss but of release. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her palms. Samuel reached down, pulling her gently to her feet. They stood there together under branches just beginning to leaf, as the wind moved soft through the grass and the stars blinked awake overhead. The house waited behind them, full, imperfect, alive, and for the first time in a long, long while, both of them stepped forward, together, toward something new,